Awaken's new synthesis, upholding the basic principles of communism and advancing the science in radically new ways, forged out of his scientific summation of his whole revolutionary experience of the movement and in conjunction with broader streams of artistic, intellectual, political thought. Now, Awaken's new synthesis of communism has developed in opposition to two other seemingly alternate but mirror opposite responses to the first end of the first stage of communist revolution. The second response, which is the conception of communism, clings rather uncritically, largely uncritically, in a quasi-religious and dogmatic way to previous socialist experience and communist theory, rejecting a thoroughly scientific approach to summing up the past and advancing communist theory. The third rejects Marxism and reaches back to the 18th century and the proclaimed democratic and egalitarian ideals and social models of the bourgeois epoch, to philosophers and political theorists like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Thomas Jefferson. Now, in some cases, they discard the very term communism. In other cases, they attach the label communism to a political project that situates itself firmly within the bounds of bourgeois democratic principles. They reject real scientific analysis of the contradictions of the socialist transition, and applying bourgeois democratic criteria, distance themselves from the unprecedented breakthroughs in human emancipation represented by the Bolshevik and Chinese revolutions. Now, in the main, the second conception buys into the bourgeois verdict that the socialist societies in the Soviet Union and revolutionary China in the 20th century were bureaucratic, authoritarian, and fatally flawed. And they essentially reject what some of them call the party-state framework, the need to make revolution and have a socialist state as a transition all the way to communism with the leadership of the vanguard Communist Party through this whole process. Now, this is where we situate the political philosophy of Alain Badiou. Badiou places the demand and prescription for equality at the core of the communist project, stating, as a pure idea of equality, the communist hypothesis has no doubt existed since the beginnings of the state. In fact, the genuine communist project initiated by Marx marked a radical break in history. Marx did not conceive of communism as a realization of equality, but of a crossing of the narrow bounds of a society that had made equality the limit and horizon of people's ability to even conceptualize emancipation. Marx writes, quote, "Socialism is the declaration of the permanence of revolution, the class dictatorship of the proletariat as the necessary transit point to the abolition of class distinctions generally, the abolition of all relations of production on which they rest, to the abolition of all the social relations that correspond to these relations of production, and the revolutionizing of all the ideas that result from these social relations." End quote. This is what is referred to as the Four Alls, popularized during the Cultural Revolution in China. It will be a running theme in my presentation, as it constitutes the most succinct description of what communism and the communist revolution is all about, abolishing or getting beyond the Four Alls. Now, in talking about getting beyond classes, Marx roots this in what is fundamental about society: exploitative production relations through which the economy functions and which give rise to classes and on which classes rest. There are corresponding social relations, corresponding not in some narrow one-to-one sense, but that are consistent with class society and the oppressive relations bound up with it. For example, in the US, you have male supremacy and white supremacy, which in some sense are pre-capitalist in origin, but have been incorporated and integrated into this structure, historically bound. And even while in some ways undermined, they're integrated and incorporated in some even more vicious ways. The Four Alls crucially includes traditional ideas, ways of thinking and outlook, again, that correspond to these exploitative and oppressive production and social relations. Again, not in some narrow one-to-one sense, but those, for example, that reflect commodity production and exchange. All of these are very closely bound together, dialectically linked. And transformation in any realm impact the entire complex. And all of this has to be dug out, struggled against, and transformed in its own right and as part of the whole. Marx is talking about getting beyond commodity relations in all realms, crossing, in his words, the narrow horizon of bourgeois right. Badiou's is a different project. In examining Alain Badiou's political project in this polemic, we asked throughout, will this lead to emancipation? Our answer is a definitive no. It leaves the world fundamentally unchanged, with capitalism and imperialism continuing to hum in the background, crushing lives and destroying spirits, in its meat grinder of exploitation. In this context, I would like to focus on the basic question of state and revolution, since it constitutes the crucial dividing line between Badiou's project and radically changing the world. Now, the polemic is really extensive. It goes into his radical politics of equality, Badiou's repudiation of class and the search for a post-Marxist subject, his summation of the Cultural Revolution and the Shanghai Commune, and his conception of politics at a distance from the state and the event. And we'll hopefully get into some of this during the discussion, especially the event, given the events in Egypt. While at some times recognizing the genuinely emancipatory impulse of the first wave of communist revolutions in socialist societies, Badiou's summation is that these revolutions were doomed to failure and even devolved into monstrosities, in his words. Why? For Badiou, the state qua state, the state as such, is the problem. For Badiou, the state is an oppressive instrument, a weight on the masses, regardless of whose hands it is in, and it cannot be used for emancipation. His politics of emancipation, therefore, in his words, is a politics for which state power is neither an objective nor a norm. What Badiou rejects summarily, right, is that there's class content to the state. It is an instrument and form of class rule serving and reinforcing underlying production relations. Speaking to this aspect, Lenin stated rather bluntly, the state is nothing but a machine for the suppression of one class by another. Now, the state has historically evolved, and it appears to stand above society, but in essence is a product and manifestation of irreconcilable class antagonisms and serves the function of keeping conflict within the bounds of order favorable to the maintenance of class domination. This state power is ultimately concentrated in the monopoly of legitimate armed force. This question, for example, is posed rather sharply in Egypt now, with the role of the reactionary army of the old oppressive order. This army, the Egyptian army, funded, structured, and trained over many decades to serve and enforce the old oppressive order, simply cannot serve and enforce radically different production and social relations and be the backbone of a different state power. Marx, in fact, in his summation of the Paris Commune, makes this point, noting that the proletariat, quote, cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. And I might add, cannot ignore it with wishful thinking either with non-violent revolutions or politics at a distance from the state. In fact, this conclusion of Marx's was considered so important, it was the only amendment he and Engels introduced into the 1872 edition of the Communist Manifesto. Bourgeois democracy, what we have in the US, is a form of class rule, the dictatorship of the capitalist class that serves and reinforces the private appropriation of socially produced wealth. In class society, those who dominate the economy, and in this capitalist imperialist society, it's big finance capital and those who own the large-scale means of production, also dominate political power in the political process, bringing to the fore political leaders representing those relations. Laws in society reflect and are consistent with the same production relations, the imperative of capitalist logic. There's no right to eat or no right to shelter, if you take the world as a whole especially. It is entirely legal for companies to lay you off, for your homes to be foreclosed, for you to possibly go hungry and homeless. But capitalist logic and its profit imperative, right? It's imperative, its codified laws will not allow the hungry to just go take food off supermarket shelves or reoccupy foreclosed homes, even if they're empty. And it is through this control of levels of political power as well that the bourgeoisie also monopolizes the use of legitimate armed force. Let's look at what the bourgeoisie does with its monopoly of legitimate armed force, its police force and its army. Here, just in New York, you have the police stop and frisking hundreds and thousands of black and Latino youth every fucking year. In fact, in Pace University, you had recently the killing of DJ Henry, a student at the White Plains campus. Just recently. People should check these stories out. Or the US military and its wars of aggression in Afghanistan and Iraq. When people expressed their protest marching in millions, Bush said he does not listen to focus groups. At least he was being honest. This is the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Or look, this is what they do with their monopoly of legitimate armed force. This is what they do with their state power. Obama threatens military action against Gaddafi, tells Libya to end attacks on civilians, or US and its allies will use force. Where is this concern when the Saudis and the US crush the Bahrainis and kill them doing exactly the same protest? Or look at Egypt now, for example, right? I mean, this is the army to which torture was outsourced by the US. Renditions aplenty to Egypt. What are they doing now? I read yesterday that they're back to torturing people. This army is not going to change its stripes. There is no real politics of emancipation without confronting, defeating, and dismantling these forces of the old order, without a revolution and state power. Badiou, proceeding from a viewpoint that state power is neither an objective nor a norm, is not seriously grappling with the question of how to make revolution, especially in imperialist countries. There's no substantive case offered than the repetition of conventional wisdom that it's hard to make revolution. Okay, we know that. It's really hard work to make revolution in any country, especially imperialist countries with its long periods of stability and normalcy and its parasitism. And Badiou essentially and objectively sidesteps this by theorizing the event and advocating a politics of distance from the state. Now, these are some of the real challenges confronted by Avakian and the party he leads, and they're figuring out a strategy for revolution in imperialist countries like the US. And yes, there is a radically new synthesis on this. There's a statement from the RCP USA on the strategy for revolution. A radically different state power is needed to abolish the exploitative production relations in the economic base of society and establish, defend, and advance different production relations that are in line with getting beyond the four alls. And without these radically different production relations and a state power to defend them against the imperialists and those seeking to restore capitalism, you are back in capitalism imperialism with all its attendant horrors. And this is why Lenin incisively noted, without state power, all is illusion. Think about all the things that are not possible today that with a new state power would become almost immediately possible. An economy that's driven not by exploitation and the profit imperative, but by the needs of the people and the increasingly conscious control. An end to all wars of aggression, to torture, to Guantanamo. End to the support of the oppressive rulers and despots around the world who serve as US lackeys. Immediate steps to reverse global warming and implement socialist sustainable development, not green capitalism. A complete access to abortion without all these Christian fascists victimizing women. And more broadly, a liberating framework for struggling against and transforming all the oppressive gender relations, including the oppression of gays and lesbians. An end to the criminalization, the demonization, and the police brutality of Black and Latino youth. The hunting down and the persecution of immigrants on the border and everywhere else in this country. But these things can't just be declared. There has to be a state power to back up these changes and masses who will want to make them. And the list goes on and on and on. Now, Badiou talks about the pure idea of equality. Can you seriously talk about eliminating social inequalities without state power? State power in the hands of the right class is an instrument of emancipation. Contra Badiou, it is right, it is necessary, it is great, and it is communist to want state power, especially at this time in history when we have a vision of socialism that is viable and desirable. Socialist states are a radically different type of state, representing a different class rule, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Badiou has commented that he sees little strategic signification, quote, in the change between bourgeois and socialist states. Now, what is similar to bourgeois states are, yes, they are both states representing the rule of a class. Now, what is radically different, and here I'm going to paraphrase from here, the preamble to the Constitution for the new Socialist Republic in North America draft proposal from the RCP, right? This is in the preamble. In contrast to the way in which the capitalist imperialist state serves and enforces the interests of a small ruling group of exploiters, the new Socialist Republic of North America, with the continuing leadership of the Revolutionary Communist Party, one, bases itself on and proceeds from the fundamental interests of those most bitterly exploited and oppressed under the old system and the masses of people broadly. Two, provides the means for them to play an increasingly widening role in the exercise of political power and the functioning of society in accordance with those interests. And three, in order to carry forward the struggle to transform society with the goal of uprooting and finally eliminating all oppressive and exploitative relations among human beings and the destructive, antagonistic conflicts these relations give rise to. Socialist states are constituted for revolutionary struggle and transformation, getting beyond the four alls so that the necessity and basis for this class dictatorship and for the states of any kind, including itself, and for any kind of organized apparatus of repression by which one group in society dominates another is also overcome as part of the world process in the advance to communism. And there is a whole new synthesis and re-envisioning of the socialist state that is embodied in this constitution. The question is not whether we need state power, a new state power, The question is, how is this state power exercised? And what is described in this constitution goes radically beyond what was conceived and practiced in the Soviet Union and China, in terms of the institutionalized leading role of the party, protecting the rights of the individuals, elections, and many, many other things. And its whole conception as a vibrant and dynamic society, wild and woolly as opposed to a straight line march forward, and characterized by great intellectual, political, and artistic ferment, dissent, experimentation, and initiative. That is also a revolutionary transition to communism. This dictatorship of the proletariat, the DOP, is not your father's or grandfather's DOP. If what you're aiming for is merely a subjective feeling for the pure idea of equality, then a politics in which state power is neither the objective nor the norm may provide that illusion. But if what you're going for is beyond the four alls, which includes but does not stop at eliminating inequalities, and in fact transcends the very notion of equality and inequality, then communist revolution and this socialist state with the leadership of the Communist Party is necessary and the most liberating instrumentality the masses have. Now, Badiou has rejected all this and looks back to the 18th century for inspiration and guidance. We don't need a return to Rousseau. We know how that played out. We are living this horror movie today. That horror movie we are living today. The reality of today, capitalism, imperialism, the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, and as Engels so rightfully stated, the social contract of Rousseau, quote, came into being and could only come into being as a democratic bourgeois republic. So, not back to Rousseau, but advance forward to communism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Chris Cutrone.
All right, I think I'm going to speak from a seated position. All right. The title of my presentation is Badou's Communism, a Gerontic Disorder. Perhaps the most condemnatory thing that could be said of Badou's communism was something Badiou himself wrote when he defined communism as a Kantian regulatory ideal, a norm to be aspired to rather than a concrete reality to be achieved. This not only besmirched the historical Marxist idea of communism, but also Kant. For Kant addressed freedom as something that could and should be, not as a utopia. And Marx remained deeply engaged in practical politics. Leon Trotsky wrote, more than 100 years ago, after the 1905 Russian Revolution, that, quote, Marxism converted socialism into a science, but this does not prevent some Marxists from converting Marxism into a utopia. Trotsky also wrote that in academies it might be possible artificially to detain the proletariat for 50, 100, or 500 years. But in the course of all-round life in capitalist society, on the basis of unceasing class struggle, the growth of the consciousness of the proletariat transforms this class struggle, gives it a deeper and more purposeful character. Trotsky was not a utopian any more than Kant or Marx were. However, as we know, such unceasing class struggle that Trotsky had in mind, which could transform the consciousness of the proletariat and potentially give it a deeper and more purposeful character, is precisely what the world has been missing for at least a generation. The Marxist vision for proletarian socialism has passed almost completely into oblivion. Badou's late redefinition of communism is a response, an adaptation to this historical reality. Indeed, Trotsky was writing at the crest of Second International Marxism, which developed in the period from 1871 to 1917, whose history Badiou deliberately seeks to bury. Badiou characterizes this period, like our own, as an interval in which the communist hypothesis was declared to be untenable, with the adversary in ascendant. What is the basis of Badiou's judgment of this period, 1871 to 1917, in which not only did bourgeois society go through its last great flowering in the Belle Epoque, but Marxism itself flourished as an international workers' movement, commanding a dedication to socialist revolution by millions in the core capitalist countries? The period between the Paris Commune and the October Revolution was not in any way like ours. It was not cynical, but optimistic in the sense of historical mission and the real potential of human progress. Badiou shares the skepticism that has developed regarding such historical potential. Indeed, we can say that Badiou is typical of the 1960s era New Left in this regard. Badiou cannot recognize Second International Marxism as an advance. Moreover, Badu is, in Trotsky's sense, academic, despite his avowed intentions. The last thing Badu imagines is that he has conceded. Badu's entire philosophy was developed out of a concern for fidelity, resisting the apostasies of the 1968 generation in the decades that followed. The question is, to what does Badu claim fidelity? Certainly not Marxism. What has sanctioned Badu to bury the admittedly obscure history of the first wave of Marxism in the Second International today? And why does Badu find an affinity in our own moment with that of the pre-World War I period, which otherwise seems so unlikely? In certain respects, Badu is rather optimistic in finding such an affinity, hoping that today we are in a period of preparation for the realization of more radical social transformation, revolution, down the road. Badu thus tries to keep fidelity to the revolution in his estimation of the present. But which revolution? Badu is clear that his model for revolution is May 1968 in France and the contemporaneous Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution in China. Presumably, in the latter case, this means a commitment to Mao and Marxism-Leninism. But beneath this, there is a certain unmistakable pessimism to the characterization of the formative era of Lenin's Marxism in the Second International as being, like ours, one of conservative reaction. Was the growth of Marxism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries really a retreat after the defeat of the Paris Commune? Or has Badu mistaken one revolution for another? Badu has maintained fidelity not to communism in Marx's sense, but rather to democracy, that is, the eternal bourgeois revolution. It is thus significant that Badu dates modern communism not to Marx in 1848, but to the Jacobins in 1792. This obscures the history that came between. The truth is that Badu's communism is deeply anti-Marxist, not merely non-Marxist in the sense of what it tends to leave out, but actually hostile to the history of Marxism. Perhaps this, in and of itself, is unremarkable. Perhaps it is not even a problem. But it may bear some inquiry into the potential consequences that might flow from this. Perhaps Badu is quietly acknowledging that Marxism may have become an obstacle to the kind of social change that, in his estimation, is possible and necessary. Possible and desirable and necessary. That is a real question. In other words, does Marxism speak to the needs of the present? But to consider this, to consider what Badu may have to offer as an alternative to Marxism, we must address what Badu means by communism. Badu defines communism as radical democratic equality. The hypothesis that motivates communism, according to Badu, is that, quote, the logic of class, the fundamental subordination of labor to a dominant class, the arrangement that has persisted since antiquity, is not inevitable. It can be overcome. A different collective organization is possible, one that will eliminate the inequality of wealth and even the division of labor. The existence of a coercive state separate from civil society will no longer appear a necessity. A long process of reorganization based on a free association of producers will see it withering away. Close quote. Furthermore, and this is a quote that Nayi used, as an idea of pure equality, the communist hypothesis has no doubt existed since the beginnings of the state, namely 10,000 plus years. As soon as mass action opposes state coercion in the name of egalitarian justice, rudiments or fragments of the communist hypothesis start to appear. Popular revolts, the slaves led by Spartacus, the peasants led by Munzer, might be identified as practical examples of this communist invariant. With the French Revolution, the communist hypothesis then inaugurates the epoch of political modernity. Close quote. However, the potential for emancipated humanity expressed in communism that Marx recognized in the modern history of capital is not assimilable without remainder to a pre- or non-Marxian socialism. Marx's thought and politics are not continuous with the Spartacus slave revolt against Rome or the teachings of the apostles, or with the radical egalitarianism of the Protestants or the Jacobins. So what was Marx's distinct contribution? As Marx put it, quote, communism is the necessary form and dynamic principle of the immediate future, but communism as such is not the goal of human development, the form of human society, close quote. This was because, according to Marx, quote, communism is a dogmatic abstraction and only a particular manifestation of the humanistic principle and is infected by its opposite, private property, close quote. Marx was not the preeminent communist of his time, but rather its critic, seeking to push it further. The best Marxists who followed him, such as Lenin, Luxemburg, Trotsky, and others, similarly sought to push their respective political movement of revolutionary social democracy in the Second International further. In so doing, they revealed and grappled with the form of capital in their moment in history, what they called imperialism, seeking to make it into capital's highest and last stage, that is, the eve of revolution. Badiou, by contrast, addresses inequality as a timeless perennial problem. He thus departs fundamentally from Marx and Marxism and liquidates the revolution of capital. Badiou conceives of the relation between freedom and equality as an ontological one, in the mathematical terms of set theory, trans-historicizing it. Badiou's background is in Lacanian and Althusserian post-structuralist French thought, in common with other prominent New Left era thinkers and former students of Althusser, such as Etienne Balibar and Jacques Rancière. Althusser found in the Russian and Chinese revolutions a salutary challenge to the notion of a Hegelian logic of history, that revolutionary change could and indeed did happen as a matter of contingency. Althusser took great inspiration from Mao in China and Lenin in Russia for advancing the possibility of emancipation against a passive expectancy of automatic evolution in the historical process of capital. For Badiou, this means that emancipation must be conceived of as an event, which involves a fundamental reconsideration of ontology. Badiou does not conceive of the transformation of the capitalist mode of production that would allow for overcoming the socially pernicious aspects of specifically capitalist forms of inequality. By contrast, Marx looked forward to the potential for overcoming the conditions of possibility for the reproduction of capitalist class dynamics in the mode of production itself, capital's overcoming of the need to accumulate the value of surplus labor time. Marx saw this historical potential to overcome this socially mediating aspect of labor, expressed, for instance, in automated machine production. However, Marx also foresaw that, short of socialism, the drive to accumulate surplus value results in producing a surplus population, an industrial reserve army of potential workers who thus remain vulnerable to exploitation. A politics based only in the workers' democratic discontents can result not in the overcoming of the social need for labor, but in the capitalist demand for more labor, the demand to be put to work. Or, as Max Horkheimer, director of the Marxist Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, put it, machines have, quote, not made work, but rather the workers superfluous. Marx anticipated this when he warned that the realization of the socialist demand to abolish private property would merely make society as a whole into one giant capitalist dominating its members. Marx even went so far as to analogize this with socialist calls to abolish marriage as a bourgeois institution, which he said would result only in universal prostitution. Indeed, that capitalism was already bringing this about. For Marx, elimination of a separate capitalist class would not in itself be emancipatory unless a transformation in the mode of production and its social relations came about. Marx did not think that the capitalists were the cause, but rather the effect of capital, calling them its character masks. Nonetheless, Marx endorsed, however critically, the traditional socialist demand to abolish private property and expropriate the expropriators, regarding this as a necessary first step. Necessary but not sufficient to realize a society beyond the mode of production and social relations of capital, as Lenin underscored this in The State and Revolution on the eve of the October 1917 revolution in Russia. Such social relations of bourgeois society, namely the mutual exchange of labor as the form of social solidarity and capital, could only be transformed gradually and thus wither away, and not be abolished and replaced at a single stroke. The proletarian socialist revolution was supposed to open the door to this transformation, not in itself carry it out. But since then, the history of the Russian and Chinese revolutions has showed another potential, that is, the reconstitution of capital under the guise of socialism. Marx had already foreseen such a possibility in the limited consciousness of his socialist and communist contemporaries in the 19th century, and he criticized them ruthlessly for this. Marx and Lenin recognized a problem in socialism itself that their supposed followers have neglected or avoided. All of this remains hidden to Badiou. But it is precisely this Marxist approach to capital as a mode of production or form of society that distinguishes Marx from other socialists or communists, and motivated revolutionaries who followed Marx, such as Lenin, maintaining that Marxism pursued the possibility of overcoming capital on the basis of capitalism itself. Badiou situates emancipatory possibilities rather atavistically in a prehistorical ontology, to which the philosophy of mathematics, for instance the question of number and numbers, the title of one of his books, can be an adequate guide. For Badu, in a procedure that recalls a self-criticism session or assembly at a re-education camp, matter itself, in its open-ended recombinations, poses the solution to what Marx called communism, or the riddle of history. Each element must be broken down to its radical potentiality for permutation, for instance in the Maoist revolutionary people, for emancipatory change to take place. It is not for nothing that Badu conceives of revolution not as a process, but as an event, or that his conception of process is founded on a conception of the event. On the other hand, Badu finds Marxists such as Lenin and Marx himself conceding to the existing social hierarchies and thus betraying the idea of communism. For instance, in the party state, which Badu regards in retrospect as a failed experiment. Thus, Badu. What of Marx and Marxism? Marx distinguished capitalist inequality from that of the traditional caste system that had characterized civilization for millennia before the emergence of capitalist society in the post-Renaissance world. As Adorno pointed out, to call all of history the history of class struggles was to indict all of history, and thus to consign it to the mere prehistory of authentic humanity. But this humanity was itself historically specific and emergent to the era of capital. Just as traditional inequality was not the cause of the form of community that the ancients regarded as being divine in origin, capitalist inequality was not the cause but the effect, the product of the cosmos of capital. Marx's magnum opus, Capital, explored how post-industrial revolution society of capital produced a new form of inequality between capitalist and worker, but one liable to be cast and responded to in the form of the original revolt of the Third Estate that had ushered in modern bourgeois form of life in the 17th and 18th centuries. Marx found an important disparity, a self-contradiction, to have developed between the political aspirations of the subjects of capital, social democracy, and the potential of capital to go beyond bourgeois society and its forms of politics, liberalism and democracy. This did not make Marx and those who followed him illiberal or anti-democratic, but they did regard liberalism and democracy, the combined libertarian and social egalitarian impulses in modern politics, as means and not as ends in and of themselves. This is because they regarded capitalism itself as a process and not merely a state of being. Marx and his best followers, such as Lenin, looked forward not merely to more liberalism and more democracy, but to the potential transcendence of the need for both liberalism and democracy, an end to politics as presently practiced. But not all at once, and not by denying them in the present. Capital is not an eternal event of inequality that needs to be met with the event of revolution. My contention is not that Badu denies liberalism and democracy, but rather unconsciously reaffirms their present bourgeois forms at a deeper and more obscure level. Badu's ontology of radical egalitarian democracy provides not a critical recognition, but rather a philosophical affirmation of the way bourgeois society already proceeds, however contradictorily. Badu mystifies. The challenge is to recognize the symptomatic character of liberalism and democracy in the crisis of capital, as it had developed in the 19th century, setting the stage for the history that came later. But such symptomology was not to be cured in the sense of elimination, but rather undergone and worked through. As Nietzsche put it, modernity is, quote, an illness, but the way pregnancy is an illness, bringing forth new life. The problem, as Marx recognized it, was that by the mid-19th century, when bourgeois society entered into crisis after the Industrial Revolution and became proletarianized, humanity faced a situation in which, as Engels later described it, the capitalists were no longer, and the workers not yet able, to master the society of capital. Marx regarded this as the source of the authoritarianism of the modern capitalist nation-state, despite the promises of classical bourgeois liberalism for a minimal state and a free cosmopolitan civil society that, for instance, would reduce legislatures to at most sites of public debate and political recognition of social facts already accomplished on the ground. What Kant, for one, expected to happen. But the bourgeoisie could no longer, and the proletariat not yet, rule modern society. The genie of capital has been let loose. The historical task of emancipating humanity has thus fallen from the bourgeois to the proletarian members of society. Marxists have recognized that this is the situation in which the world has remained stuck ever since then, ever since the failed social democratic revolution of 1848, on the eve of which Marx and Engels had published their inaugural manifesto. For Marx, the demand for social democracy was part of the history of capital, to be worked through imminently and transcended. But none of this registers for Badu. Marx marked a potential turning point for humanity. He was not merely one in a chain of prophets reaching back for thousands of years. He was a thinker and political actor in our modern time. The cost of liquidating the specific history of capital, its peculiar constraint on society, and its potential beyond itself, is Badou's reduction of communism to the perennial complaint of the subaltern, the millennial dream of social equality, as a specter haunting the world that has more in common with eschatological justice, posed by religion at the end of time, than with the pathology of the modern bourgeois world of capital in which humanity actually suffers today. We must awaken from this nightmare, the vain wish that things be otherwise, of the oppressed. For we are not only oppressed, but rather tasked by capital. Nevertheless, the failure of historical Marxism has made Badu an evidently adequate symptomatic expression of our time, its confusion and diminished expectations, well shy of the epochal transformation that had motivated Marx and the best Marxists historically. We must remember Marxism so we can forget Badu. Forget the time that made such an ideology, such naturalization, indeed ontologization of defeat so appealing, and finally consign it where it belongs to prehistory.
Thank you very much. Now, Bruno Bosteels.
Okay. Well, I had prepared some statements, but I think it might be more interesting to try to answer some of the polemics. Also because originally I thought to just evade the polemic, because I'm to a large extent in agreement with parts of the statement of the RCP USA and also parts of the statement that Chris had published before in two different texts. But I still think that there are a number of problems that are not addressed in this attack. And to simplify it, I would invert the question. If Chris finished by saying we should remember Marx so as to forget Badiou, my question basically is why contemporary calls to remember Marx feel the need to pass by the forgetting of Badiou. And I think that there's a really interesting question there. Why it is that these calls for a return to Marx or a continuation of the RCP or the new synthesis, why those appeals feel the need at all to pass through Badiou. Right? And I think this is not simply a question of the projection or the attraction that Badiou has exerted over the past years in terms of just publishing, which would basically be a marketing question. I think there's a much more interesting question, which is the relation between what I would call, a certain framework of talking about communism and socialism, and what Badiou himself calls speculative leftism, or leftism, which of course is the infantile disease that you now turned into the gerontic disease. But I think that there is something to be said about understanding the dialectic between those tendencies, and that in fact communism, even historical communism, constantly rejuvenates itself. I don't think it's a question of becoming senile, but it rejuvenates itself by dipping back into a certain form of leftism. Now, I agree with the question or with the statement that Badiou, in these recent texts, by cutting loose the sort of the communist idea from all forms of hitherto existing organization, falls into the traps of what he himself calls speculative leftism. But it would be interesting, at the very least, to study what Badiou has had to say about leftism as a deviation before jumping to the conclusion that he is simply a bourgeois 18th century thinker. Because I don't think that helps us at all. Because then we just get a stereotype about Rousseau and we have no sense of what Badiou is really about. So let me historicize this, because after all, if we want to claim to be materialist and historical, we should also do the same with Badiou's ideas. Right? We cannot simply treat them in the way we claim Badiou is treating history as an eternal transhistorical or even prehistorical essence. Badiou himself has had two major statements about the question about communism. The first important series of statements was in the 1970s, when he first defined, and I think if this is not convincing, then we should just leave the room, I think. Very simple idea that there are communist invariants, and they are in fact transhistorical and eternal. And this is what he means by every time there is a revolt of the masses, that in the 1970s he calls them anti-property, anti-hierarchy, and anti-authority rudiments. or ideas. The struggle of masses against property, hierarchy, and authority. These he calls communist invariants. But it doesn't remain there in the 1970s. In the 1970s, Badiou insists that the communist invariants as mass ideas need to be organized. And that the historical question is, what historical and political forms of organization give actual shape in different sequences to those ideas, to those invariants. In other words, there is historical variation, and there are a certain number of communist invariants. The whole purpose of Badiou's analysis in the 1970s is to understand the dialectic. The communist invariants for him are mass ideas. The historical variation happens, according to Badiou in the 1970s, through the apparatus of mass, party, and state. So Badiou, the Maoist in the 1970s, really insists if we cut loose these communist invariants, we do in fact fall into the trap of a certain type of leftist deviation. So in a sense, in the 70s, Badiou is attacking exactly the same type of problem that Chris and Sam see in the question of Badiou's communism today. Right? But then the question is, how did Badiou go from that sequence in the 1970s and his own experience to his contemporary 2008, 2009 affirmation of communism, which again seems to cut loose the communist invariants, now even reduced to a singular communist invariant, sort of, radical equality. He never calls it radical democratic equality because that's a sort of a U.S. debate about radical democracy, about which, Badiou has in which he has no stakes. But what has happened to understand the shift from the 1970s to this attempt to reinitiate the communist hypothesis in 2000? Because Badiou held on to this until Theory of the Subject. It's a book of 1982, which basically occupies in French thought a position roughly equivalent to Barbavakian's new synthesis in the contemporary ideological arena. Mainly, largely ignored, and seemingly, sticking to a renewed orthodoxy. And this is exactly how Badiou was perceived until the early 1980s, and why it was completely reviled. So, one way of reading the shift would be Badiou has basically abandoned his older allegiances and has become a vulgar anti-Marxist. But I think there is something more interesting going on. If you look at the second moment, when in the late 2000s, he begins to reaffirm the communist idea, and he quickly abandoned the notion that it would be a Kantian regulative idea, because he realized, of course, this would get him, again, trapped into this notion of sort of a utopian egalitarianism that is entirely cut loose from history. When he proposes now to do a historicization of communism and proposes those two sequences, 1791, 1871, and the second sequence, 1917 to 1976, it is true, of course, as Chris points out, that the intervals are obviously where the most interesting developments happen. But there's also something attractive about the simple notion, which of course the polemicists have realized is a very attractive notion, that we can historicize the communist hypothesis, and that it is very well possible to initiate a new sequence of this communist hypothesis. I think launching that very simple idea that he believes a new sequence is possible, but then therefore also a break is necessary with the older paradigm, which he doesn't call failed. I don't think you will find a lot of statements in Badiou saying that these are failed projects. They're saturated projects, or they are projects whose sequence no longer really serves as a model for today. It is true, of course, that if we read his statement in the Communist Hypothesis, this is no longer related to Marxism at all. He says, Marxism, the workers' movement, mass democracy, Leninism, the party of the proletariat, the socialist state, all the inventions of the 20th century are not really useful to us anymore. At the theoretical level, they certainly deserve further study and consideration, but at the level of practical politics, they have become unworkable. So that today, in any case, the solution will be neither the formless or multiform popular movement inspired by the intelligence of the multitude, as Negri and the alter globalists believe, nor the renewed and democratized mass communist party as some of the Trotskyists and Maoists hope. The 19th century movement and the 20th century party were specific modes of the communist hypothesis. It is no longer possible to return to them. He's not saying these were failures. He's saying that in the 21st century, it might be necessary to organize the communist invariants in a different way. He's not saying that they should be left floating as utopian ideas, let alone Rousseauian sort of bourgeois, democratic, liberal, formal rights. If anything, Badiou has spent quite a bit of time in the 1990s attacking the notion of right, attacking the notion of a bourgeois state, most notably in his book of an obscure disaster, which is his take on the fall of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall. But what has happened for Badiou to move from this dialectic between communist invariance and mass party historical implementation of those ideas in the 1970s to a communist hypothesis completely shorn of any form of organization? I believe that Badiou goes to the opposite extreme, as perhaps some of the Avakians who will claim that no break is necessary at all, that we are to do nothing but remember and go back to a well-tried formula. Badiou exaggerates in the other extreme by saying we need a clean break, we need to reinvent everything from the ground up. For me, the problem with Badiou's proposal of the communist hypothesis does not lie in the return to an 18th century bourgeois liberalism, but rather with the peculiar place he assigns to philosophy. Why do I say that it is not about a return to a radical egalitarianism in a certain bourgeois democratic sense? Because there are too many elements in Badiou's work, aside from the book, The Communist Hypothesis, and the contributions to the London Conference, that point in the direction of a very strong critique of this type of leftist communism, or left-wing communism. And he shares this critique with somebody like Rancière. I believe Rancière is the first to use the expression speculative leftism as one of the names to talk about the legacy of 1968, particularly among Althusserians. And Rancière writes, the double Althusserian truth after May 68 is shattered into two poles. The speculative leftism of the all-powerful ideological apparatuses and the speculative Zdanovism of the class struggle in theory that interrogates each word to make it confess its class. So on the one hand, Rancière believes that Maoist Althusserians have gone in the direction of either a certain type of speculative leftism, the assertion of a complete radical break with all types of class relation, or if you want, a complete break with the four alls. And on the other hand, what we might also call kind of speculative rightism, which is studying every ideological construct to make it confess its class, and sort of finding the truth of social class content behind all forms of ideology. Now, French Maoism, of course, was key, according to this portrayal of speculative leftism in Rancière's early work. This is drawn from his book on Althusser's lesson. But Badiou, unlike what we might expect, actually joins Rancière in this critique of speculative leftism. In the central meditation, in Being an Event, which is called The Intervention, Badiou gives us the following definition of speculative leftism. So I think what Badiou is being accused of today is precisely speculative leftism. That would be a more helpful polemic, I believe, than Rousseau versus Marx. Because it also suggests that Badiou ignores the history of that theoretical debate within Marxism, which he certainly does not. And Badiou writes, we can term speculative leftism any thought of being which bases itself upon the theme of an absolute commencement or an absolute radical beginning, sort of a clean slate. Speculative leftism imagines that intervention authorizes itself on the basis of itself alone, that it breaks with the situation without any other support than its own negative will. this imaginary wager upon an absolute novelty to break into the history of the world, Nietzsche's phrase, of sort of the grand politics, that's going to be a before and an after, I'm dynamite, I'm going to break history into sort of radical anarchistic form of speculative leftism, according to Badiou. This fails to recognize that the real of the conditions of possibility of intervention is always the circulation of an already decided event. In other words, it is a presupposition, implicit or not, that there has already been an intervention. Speculative leftism is fascinated by the eventual ultra one, by some kind of a grand event that's a transcendent occurrence to which one pledges blind allegiance. And it believes that in the latter's name it can reject any imminence to the structured regime of the Countess One. I think this is how Badiou is read today in Anglo-Saxon literature. He is read as a speculative leftism who calls for a radical sort of novelty, the event that transcends all the given imminence of a particular situation, which one would be able to analyze, let's say, according to the Marxian analysis of capital, in favor of this ultra one, right? The grand event, very often then in summaries transcribed with a big capital E, like in Zizek's summaries. He always capitalizes all these words, being an event, which is, again, kind of an apocryphal, irrecognizable transformation of Badiou. Badiou claims against this, what the doctrine of the event teaches us is rather that the entire effort lies in following the event's consequences. And following the event's consequences, of course, means organizing it, structuring it. But then today he will say the form of organization of an event's consequences, according to him, can no longer find models in the older forms of the party or the party state. And not in glorifying its occurrence. There is no more an angelical herald of the event than there is a hero. Being does not commence. There is no such thing as this big event that people slap onto their readings of Badiou. So that's, I think, an important insight, a brief reminder of a persistent strain within Badiou's own thinking to criticize the kind of ultra-leftism or radical egalitarianism that he is accused of proposing today. Now, why then, in the book The Communist Hypothesis, when Badiou raises again the idea of communism, does he reject all known forms of organization? And in a sense proposes a communist hypothesis that would no longer be Marxist. I think that's a fair, what Chris is claiming, that this is perhaps communist, but then probably too linked to the kind of communism that Marx was criticizing, and certainly not Marxist. I think that one answer to this, and that's a treatment that I find missing in the polemic of the RCP and Chris's polemic, is that this is not so much a concession as the interiorization of defeat of a certain Western European left, and that the politics of thinking at a distance from the state is the result of post-1970s party-state communist politics within Western Europe. And that Badiou then, like Negri, generalizes that historical experience, which then in a sense projects that interiorized defeat onto the entire globe. Now, Badiou doesn't claim that this is a truth for the entire world. He will always insist, look, politics are local, politics are situated, and that he has no real claim that this assessment of the experience of emancipatory politics within France, most notably, should not be transposed. Just as in the 1970s he said, we are not talking about Chinese Maoism. Maoism is not something that you just transpose or translate from one historical situation into another. In the same way, I don't think we should transpose or translate Badiou's hypotheses, which with their materialist history, onto a different situation. My own take on this is much closer to Daniel Ben Said's work than to Badiou's, which is to say that one should be wary of generalizing the historical experience of the Western European sort of Euro-communist history by drawing from this the notion that the communist hypothesis can no longer adopt any of those known forms, movement, party, state apparatus, or even unions, councils, and so on. All of them, according to Badiou, are saturated. But I still think it asks of us that we study as a lesson in the history of a certain sequence in politics, that we study the reasons behind this transformation in Badiou's own thought as representative of the history of a certain Western European left. Let me conclude with a few statements from Badiou's book on Of an Obscure Disaster. Even if we accept that Badiou is, in a sense, the best critic of the type of leftism that he is now accused of propounding, I still think that the place of philosophy in Badiou's own work causes greater problems for the implementation of the communist hypothesis than his alleged leftism. First of all, in his text from the London conference in 2009, he attributes the task of the formulation of the communist idea, he attributes that to philosophy. And he claims that the communist idea is meant to triangulate a subjective experience with a particular political sequence and enables the projection of that sequence onto history with a large capital H, which is, of course, is imaginary. But the goal is, in a sense, again, to mediate and to find a point where singular and local political actions can happen that feel or project themselves onto a larger historical scene. And this happens, according to him, through the communist idea. Now, it is the philosopher's task to help this type of mediation by working out the very nature of the communist idea. And in the absence of this work of the philosopher, Badiou seems to claim even that the masses might once again be disoriented. He says, in fact, what we are ascribed as a philosophical task, we could say even a duty, is to help a new modality of existence of the hypothesis to come into being, absent which the people appear once again disoriented and confused. Lacking the idea, Badiou writes, the popular masses' confusion is inescapable. This, I believe, is the more important polemic to have. Why Badiou ascribes the task of inventing the communist idea to the philosopher, who then must, in a sense, bring this idea to the masses in order to overcome their confusion or disorientation. And it is this sort of hegemonic role of the philosopher that even the most loyal Badiouians, and I'm not one of them, that even the most loyal Badiouians object. So the London conference had one condition. All those participating had to accept that it was worthwhile returning to the communist idea today. Now, of all the participants, there were two people who did, although they accepted to go, who actually did not accept this condition. Namely Judith Balceau and Alessandro Russo. Now, Russo, I think, is an extremely interesting historian of the Maoist revolution, including the last meetings of the Red Guards with Chairman Mao. But they are also the most loyal Badiouians. These are more loyal Badiouians than Badiou himself. And then their conclusion is that communism may be an interesting idea for the philosopher, but it is no longer an interesting idea in politics. It is no longer a viable hypothesis for a political sequence. In other words, if we want to implement a type of politics of emancipation, it will not be through the path of the communist idea. And again, the reasons why they reject this is because they sense that in this proposal there is a certain, old Platonic dream of the philosopher's hegemony over politics, of a certain, in the vulgar sense, the philosopher idea. Rousseau says, for example, I consider this thesis about the communist idea, Badiou's thesis, above all a defense of philosophy, because he would pass through philosophy. And last two quotes to sort of suggest why this is a more general problem, I believe, of Badiou's work, which is why I suggest in my own work on Badiou that we have to abandon or betray Badiou's philosophy if we want to think with Badiouian categories, to avoid this centralization of much of the political labor through the task of the philosopher. Badiou writes, politics, inasmuch as it is a condition of philosophy, is a subjective procedure of truth. It finds in the state neither its primary stake nor its incarnation. Or again, the essence of this, these are quotes of an obscure disaster. The essence of politics, such that philosophy traces the concept thereof as condition of its own exercise, this politics is by no means power or the question of power. So this is not exactly the question of those who propose state and the takeover of power as the key questions of politics versus Rousseauian philosophers. This is a more convoluted debate. Badiou is saying politics, as it is a condition of the type of philosophy that he proposes, that type of politics would not be subordinated to the question of power or of the state. This is, I think, where I would initiate a polemic with Badiou, rather than with his alleged return to the 18th century. Politics here, as a condition of philosophy, is absorbed back into the conditions, into philosophy. In the end, this is how I would describe the temptation of Badiou's speculative leftism. This is where Badiou becomes a true speculative leftism. Namely, the name for the philosophical appropriation of radical emancipatory politics, as if this radicality depended on philosophy in order to be able to subtract itself from the questions of power in the state. So it has to pass through a philosophical reflection in order to be able to put itself at a distance from the state. But then again, I believe that this type of speculative leftism is not just a name for an ideological deviation or a bourgeois regression into the arena, to be corrected by following the correct line of communism. It also and at the same time serves as a possible passageway through which philosophy communicates with the struggles, desires, and impulses that define its actuality. So I believe this could explain why this polemic has occurred in the first place. That communism also rejuvenates itself by delving into the set of struggles, desires, and impulses that on the face of it are sort of leftist, anarchistic, egalitarian ideals, but without which communism, I think, is not just gerontic, but a little more than a fossil. Thanks.
Before we get into questions, Nayi Duniya just said he's got a couple of comments he'd like to make.
Maybe we
I
can
don't know
have a
if Chris
round.
would too. Yeah, we should have a round.
Have a round.
Sure.
I mean, there's obviously, there's obviously a lot that the other speakers said that I would like to comment on, right? But just given the interest of time and the audience, I'm just going to focus on one thing, right? Which is Bruno's comment, right? Sort of his three comments, if you will. One is in terms of comparing theory of the subject in its place, right, to Avakian's new synthesis as sort of ignored and orthodox. Ignored and seen as orthodox, right? And then in the middle you had a comment that it doesn't reflect, the new synthesis doesn't reflect a break with what came before. I mean, I don't know if I've understood you correctly, right? And then your ending and closing comment about how does communism rejuvenate itself, right? Your last point about how does it rejuvenate itself, right? So I just want to tie those three things together, right? One is, look, I have to polemicize against this, right? This is such a major fucking problem that A, what is the line behind sort of ignoring this, right? Oh, the old first wave of socialist revolutions, communist revolutions and socialist societies, that was no good. We don't even have to look at it. We don't have to actually look at it scientifically and say, were there achievements, were there shortcomings? No. Same old party state, no good, right? And what is the line behind ignoring? Oh, and awakens to new synthesis, there's nothing new. He upholds the party state, therefore there's nothing new, right? There's no break. No, I'm just sort of walking through, I'm just sort of walking through what is the underlying thinking, right? And I really feel there's a polemic to be had on both fronts, right? That is, one is, what is a correct, that's why I began with that, right? What is a correct approach to this entire first wave of communist revolutions and socialist societies? You do have to look at it. This is humanity's first attempts to emancipate itself on a scientific basis. There were incredible achievements. The radical social transformations, men and women, nationalities, a whole different economy, a whole different political system, all of those things. I can go on and on and on. Serve the people ethos, etc., right? But at the same time, look, there were very serious errors. There were serious shortcomings. They ran up against serious limitations about how this transformation takes place. Even within this, there was a learning curve, right? Mao looked at the experience in the Soviet Union and said, look, there's some things that they're doing wrong. Capitalism was restored. And in looking at Stalin's errors, wooden, mechanical, materialism, some of those problems, right? I mean, we can recount some of these things. Stalin was facing major challenges, but what he reached for was not a scientific approach and not communism in many different ways, especially as it led up to the war and through the war and how the war was fought, right? I'm talking about World War II. There's real problems, and Avakian has done a very scientific analysis of what Stalin's errors were, and we continue to deepen that, right, in a certain sense. But Mao looked at it and said, look, things need to be different in China, and this is part of understanding cultural revolution, the class society and contradiction, new bourgeoisie in China and socialist society, concentrate in the vanguard party and things like that, and he launched the cultural revolution, right? People should even have an understanding of what the cultural revolution was, because Badiou basically portrays it as masses revolutionized mobilization against the party state. No, it was basically masses mobilized against the capitalist road in all its manifestations, in sort of capitalist roaders, those in power taking down the capitalist roads, and ways of thinking and institutions and ways of doing things, traditional ways of doing things in the economy. All this takes transformation, right? So one is we have to look at this experience scientifically. Look at what the achievements are, look at what the shortcomings are, because if we are to get out of this fucking world, there is no other way other than looking at this scientifically. These were humanity's first incredible attempts at emancipating itself, humanity. There's no sidestepping that, and no sidestepping the errors and shortcomings. This is why I said there's another response which doesn't want to look at the shortcomings. Awakens is not that response. He has gone back and excavated and gone back in many different ways to look at this experience. There's serious shortcomings. On the question of internationalism, in 1980, he wrote this book, Conquer the World, which Chris Cutrone has made a response to our polemic, right, on some questions of internationalism. And I actually have gone back and studying that because we want to write a polemic against sort of your polemic in a certain sense, right? It is incredible. It actually breaks new ground in looking at this experience of the first wave very critically. In fact, he was criticized by quote-unquote these religious dogmato types, saying he is reducing the first wave to a tattered flag. He is reducing communism to a tattered flag. In fact, I will grant Chris this in his polemic. He upholds that, right? Conquer the world as a breakthrough in looking at this first experience scientifically. There were errors. There were serious errors. Even in the best of cultural revolution, which the Revolutionary Communist Party and Avakian, no one upholds the cultural revolution more than he does, right? No one. Scientifically, in terms of what it was and what it represented, right? But he has pointed to serious, significant errors. There was an official ideology. I'm sorry, I'm standing up because it's passionate and matters for the world in a certain sense, right? No, there was an official ideology. Everyone had to be claimed to be communist. This is, he says, no, that can't be the case. People aren't communists. You make revolution on day one, everyone's not communist. Yes, there's tremendous transformation, but everyone's not communist. It doesn't make sense to have an official ideology. Even the way the Cultural Revolution was fought, everyone had to fight in the name of Mao. That doesn't, you were saying, it actually confused the masses. It didn't help them clarify what's right, what's wrong, what would lead forward to communism, what are people saying. And one of the things he said is, look, we can't have an official ideology. We need to have a much more united front approach. The question of truth, they had a notion, go back and look at the Chinese Constitution of 1975, which they passed in the Cultural Revolution, right? They had a notion of class truth. Truth as class character. There's bourgeois truth and there's there's bourgeois truth and there's proletarian truth. What's good for essentially what it was is, what's good for the proletarian is true. What immediately serves our revolutionary interests is true. And Avakian has gone back and criticized that notion of truth as, completely false. Truth has no class character, and that infected a lot of things, right? Because the people who were dissenting, that's treated differently. Okay, I'm going to finish in a minute, right? But I'm saying it is a completely false notion, right, that there's no break. Yes, there's a continuity with the first wave of socialist revolutions, right? But there's also a rupture. In a way, if I were to capture it succinctly, it's basically Mao ruptured with Stalin, and Avakian is continuing these ruptures, and in some ways continuing those ruptures and further rupturing with Mao himself, right? And I just want to say one point, right? I really think people should check out this constitution that I was referring to on this new socialist republic, because in the question of leadership, it is an entirely different conception of how the vanguard leadership leads to the socialist state. It is entirely different than what was done in China. Yes, the party has to lead. Without this, there is no getting to communism. It's because of the contradictions of society, the inequalities, mental manual, all that stuff, right? I can give example after example after example after example of how, yes, there's continuity, but there's also rupture, right? But, I am waging a polemic on a scientific approach to the first wave and on really engaging with Avakian so that you can't dismissively say, oh, there's no break. That is not an acceptable situation when the world calls on us, and we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to fight for a radically different world. The people of the world are counting on us even if they don't know it. People in the Middle East, people around the world. We live on the top of the imperialist food chain. It is our responsibility to figure out how the fuck to make revolution in this country and in countries around the world, not to do politics at a distance from the state. Bruno, I completely agree with you. The politics at a distance from the state is a capitulation to this whole normalcy and, oh, it's so hard. But if someone said, I know a fucking way out of prison, you're going to listen. You want to get the fuck out of prison. We should feel like that. No, I'm just waging a polemic. People need to engage this.
Chris?
Well, first, I just very briefly, I might have misconstrued the heart of the Conquer the World piece. In fact, in my kind of citation of it, and so I might have missed something there. Because in fact, I went back even before you've raised it. Now I've gone back and sort of noticed that maybe I missed something there. That said, I want to address the question of return to the 18th century, because I think that my notion of Badu as bourgeois is different from the RCP's perspective on the return of a kind of bourgeois revolutionism, whether in terms of Rousseau or Jefferson. I'd also say that I'm not accusing Badu of being a Rousseauist. In a sense, the difference would be I'm saying he's not enough of a Rousseauist, right? Now, it all hinges on the relationship between Marxism and the bourgeois revolution. And my perspective on regression is that, in a sense, we unconsciously recapitulate the 18th century in the sense of the bourgeois revolution, and that, in fact, a lot of the history of Marxism is also that unconscious recapitulation in terms of a lot of the experience of the Russian and Chinese revolution is, in fact, it's a sort of late bourgeois revolution, and I approach that dialectically, meaning I think that that's what needs to be redeemed about that experience, but it's also the limitations of that experience. So in other words, that's how I situate it. And I think that the issue of regression, it's not that I'm accusing Badu of being bourgeois by going back to the 18th century. What I'm saying is, rather, the way in which the bourgeois revolution is recapitulated is liable to sort of mystify or obscure the matter at hand. In other words, I don't think that it's possible to have the bourgeois revolution today in the same way as in the 17th and 18th century, and therefore I think that it raises the question of whether the bourgeois revolution today is, in a sense, any good. And that raises the whole question of Marxism. In other words, how to make good on the bourgeois revolution. And for that, I'm troubled by Badu's, what I would consider, as a philosopher, in a certain respect, his mathematical philosophy, his sort of ontology of the radical, kind of anarchic, maybe not democratic equality, or a radical anarchic equality of matter, his kind of notion, that I have a problem with that, certainly, but also more specifically with Badu as a political philosopher. And his sort of political philosophy of equality, I think that the issue, I think that, Bruno, what you raised is the two sort of aspects, which is the invariant versus the historically concrete, right? And that, in a sense, if you divorce one from the other, you get problems. In other words, if you divorce it, if you make it fully concrete in terms of Althusserian kind of scientific kind of Marxism, that's a problem on the one hand. And on the other hand, there's the problem of going the other way. I have a problem not so much with this sort of model, but rather how it plays out, how it sort of figures. And I think that, the issue then for me becomes, for instance, a straightforward example of this would be Spartacus. Spartacus fought against slavery, but he didn't fight against the institution of slavery. He fought against his people being enslaved, which is quite different. I think that fighting against the institution of slavery per se is an entirely modern bourgeois phenomenon. In other words, there have been, the defiance of slavery has occurred, let my people go, but let my people go. Not free all slaves everywhere. Let my people go. And I think that that's a major difference, and that, in a sense, the whole question of the bourgeois revolution and of modern revolution turns on the question of universal emancipation, which is different. And I also think is different from the Christian notion, because I know that Badu puts a great deal of emphasis on the universalism of Christianity, but I would also articulate a difference there. And so just to sort of specify what I mean by regression, in a sense what I'm saying is that we're regressing to the bourgeois revolution, but not in the best way, only in the worst way.
Okay, thanks very much. If you have something very quick.
Yeah, I just feel that I should stand up and use fucking in every sentence, but
No, it's a passionate thing. Come on.
No, but I'm a little bit, struck by the fact that I was trying to bring some of the camps together, because if we're really talking about not is there or is there not a break. When I said that theory of the subject occupies a position like of iconism, I said that as the highest form of praise. Right? And if you know how I take theory of the subject, then I'll make that work to understand precisely this type of trajectory in Badiou's own thinking. I was not saying this as a kind of rejection. So, but if the debate is then really about the degree to which there has to be a break, that's really the issue, not whether there is a break or not. Because, of course, Badiou now is accused of having gone overboard in drawing a break completely between communism and Marxism, for example, or between what you call the first sequence of the communist experience and what Badiou hopes is going to be the next one. So he's, in a sense, seen as making too clean a cut by insisting that he has a long-standing Maoist-inspired criticism of precisely this type of stance. I was only trying to broaden the horizon to somehow suggest, look, Badiou could be your ally here in making precisely criticisms of people who dream of this type of radical break, including a radical break with their own communist past, which I don't think Badiou is doing. Right? But that, again, is not to suggest that I follow the outcome of his own trajectory, which is, in fact, anti-statist and anti, to the extent that he says no existing forms of political organization will work anymore, it does also seem that he is completely anti-organization. So it was really an attempt to see, otherwise it's like, why continue the polemic? I mean, why argue with Badiou or organize a panel if that is not really furthering the cause either? Half of what you claim, the most passionate claims in your statement, I think most of us in the room, unless there's some infiltrators, agree with, but you would, agree with too. So I had a hard time juxtaposing the polemic with the passionate statements. It was as though Badiou was working now against these issues, and I think, well, Badiou's not the problem.
Right, of course.
But that's,
All right, why don't we get to some questions? You had a question here.
Yeah, well, in the polemic against Badiou is returning to Rousseau. I mean, it sometimes sounds as if RCP or the polemicists haven't engaged much with Badiou's writings on the 20th century communist sequence. I'm sure I'm glad in the question, in the responses it came up a little bit. But I mean, Badiou, what has attracted me to Badiou in places isn't so much what he's saying about the place of philosophy, which I find to be very, not always worth the work and somewhat problematic. But his particular engagements, his investigations in particularly into the Cultural Revolution, and his insistence that we be attuned to the particularities of emerging situations, whether it's in his own France or it's in, as he in his footnote here in the Communist Hypothesis, to the Zapatistas in Mexico, the Maoists in Nepal. So I mean, it's this imperative in Badiou to, the kind of the way in which the situation is primary, which to me makes what he's up to, and this imperative to kind of investigate, percolations of new types of radical politics, a lot more than a regulative, makes his communism more than a regulative idea. It's almost as if like I see the idea as a kind of holding action until the new percolations emerge, and this, I mean, and this is where I think, Bruno, what you were saying again about, the problematic or the question about the place of philosophy seems very important to me here. But I do want to point, I think it's important. I came to Badiou through ethics and other things. He's a tremendous critic, I think, of a lot of the prevailing discourses and practices and situations and wherever he's looking. And to me, that's what's. First of all, I was a communist before Badiou. I'm always curious when I go to panels like this how many people thought they were feel they were communists before they turned to someone Badiou, or how many people did Badiou bring towards communism. I'm always curious about how that works actually, and how that we might figure that into our analysis. Because sometimes it seems like RCP's approaches to Badiou, it's almost as if it's like he's hopping on the bandwagon. It's just like communism is about to inflame as a movement again, and here comes an interloper threatening to lead it astray. And I'm not quite sure that's accurate. I mean, I think we need a more dialectical understanding of how Badiou may be actually signifying in people's own radicalization process. And particularly, and to historicize him and also people's encounter with him. And I would just love to see a little more elasticity, on that particular question. Also, I just wanted to call attention. There is a panel on an actual revolution going on, or at least attempting to push its way forward, a communist revolution in Nepal tomorrow. A couple flyers left in case people are interested.
Anyone like to respond to that?
I mean, I would, but should we take a couple of questions? I mean,
Okay. Any other questions?
Okay.
Let's maybe take a couple. Go ahead.
I want to say first, though, I myself am very skeptical about this Badiou character. I do appreciate Bruno's, if I take your general stance to be, if we're going to denounce him, let's denounce the right thing. Sure. And in the spirit of that, I mean, it strikes me that the sort of antinomy or dialectic posed between politics and philosophy is a deeply problematic one. I mean, we keep on saying scientific over and over again, and we keep on proposing these sort of periodizations that go from 1871 to 1917, and 1917 to 1976, and so on. Political periodization. And it seems to me we lose track of something that Marx was interested in, I gather, economics. And like, it's not clear to me why we wouldn't sort of talk historically about periods in which capitalism as a more or less global method of accumulation is doing very well, and periods in which it's doing very poorly. We talk about 29 to 45, or from 48 to 73 when capitalism is doing quite well, and sort of try and think through what it would mean to intervene, what it would mean to engage in political action within that context, which is, after all, the vast majority of Marxist thought involves doing exactly that thing, which hasn't happened at all. And it seems to me the limit of Badiou is maybe exactly the philosophical characteristic of being resistant to that activity, and it seems to me that a proper response to that would be to take up that problematic rather than simply having this endless wrestling about who owns the idea or something like that.
Okay. Big one?
Okay.
Yeah.
My question's pretty simple, and it's mainly for Bruno, but the other panelists will probably have something to add, which is talking a lot about Badiou himself, but one thing that's obvious about Badiou and why we're here to some degree is the incredibly enthusiastic reception of a lot of his work. And what's interesting, especially, is that the Anglophone world, where he's kind of like the sort of French philosopher in New York. And I was wondering if you guys, especially Bruno, but everybody, could speak to that and why you think this is. Why Badiou, why now?
Okay.
I would like to.
Okay, try and keep it short.
Yeah. No, I think this question is very important. It sort of goes with his, couple of points here, right? Why Badiou? Why now? Because it is of this historical moment. Look, we have a historical materialist analysis of why Badiou is Badiou now. What is his appeal, right? I mean, people have, the bourgeoisie has launched this tremendous offensive about the first wave. There's imperialist countries, normalcy, stability, the 60s are over. I can go on, right? The fall of China, its material and ideological effects, all this stuff, right? And he's come forth and concentrated a certain line and a way of thinking. That's why we wrote the polemic. And we studied like hell to concentrate what are the key parts of his polemic. I'm being passionate, right? The thing is, look, in terms of Rousseau, he upholds Rousseau explicitly. Go read his first book, But anyway, Rousseau, he upholds Rousseau explicitly about the state, about the party, general will, can't be mediated, can't be represented. We situate him in Rousseau because he upholds it, and I'm a little unclear. I mean, maybe Chris can even help out on this question of Rousseau. No, I'm saying here, it's a joke. You're saying, oh, that's not the case, right? I'm just saying, if you read our polemic, we actually make the case of why we situate him with Rousseau, right? But the point I want to make, right, is the following. Look, Badiou concentrates a certain line, a certain way of thinking, and that, in our view, stands in the way of emancipation. Why? Because people have to know how the fuck to get out of this prison. And there is a way out, right? And that's the struggle and polemic to be waged, is that, will it lead to, just let me finish in 1 second, right? Yeah, I'll finish in 1 minute, right? Will it lead to emancipation or won't it? Right? And Lenin, for example, waged major polemics throughout, in terms of this making emancipation throughout the communist project. There have been major polemics, right? And I really do appreciate Bruno's point that we are, in a certain sense, a united front against the horrors of this world. I agree with that. I really appreciate that. And it is in that spirit and that context that I feel we still need to have debates and polemics amongst ourselves on what will and will not lead to emancipation. But I really do appreciate that gesture, the sentiment, right? But Badiou, I feel, is putting forth certain ideas very harmful about what the party state, what the historical experience was, the fact that it was saturated, it should be rejected, all of those things, right? So I just, this is part of why we do the polemic, right? It's to chart the way forward. But I do appreciate this thing about, look, we need to continue debating and discussing each other. I mean, I was just talking to Chris earlier, and I was saying that we need to actually continue having these debates in a spirit of friendly unity and, passion.
Absolutely. I have one thing to say about Marx as someone who's concentrated on political economy and on the question of capital. Obviously, maybe it got lost in between the sandwiching bits. But, the center of my kind of intervention with respect to this was to talk about historical specificity of capital and talk about the dangers of the reproduction of democratic discontents in the epoch of capital, the reproduction of the revolt of the Third Estate. In other words, the Russian and Chinese revolutions as being reconstitutive of capital, proletarianizing the peasantry, etc. Maybe there's a different way of overcoming capital. It's not about proletarianizing the entire world, right? Now, what I'd say about why, I think it's an open question. Why periodize in one way rather than another way? And I wanted to kind of center that question, the issue of how we regard history concretely, whether we regard it concretely in terms of cycles of capital or whether we regard it concretely in terms of cycles of politics. And I think that there might be a point in talking about both. I was emphasizing the cycle of politics in part because Badu opened the door to that, but also because I think that the cycle of politics is itself the more obscure question. In other words, in fact, the cycle of the reproduction of capital, when capital seems to kind of manage its crisis better or worse and in different ways, the organic composition of capital, that kind of analysis that Marx engaged in, I think that, in a sense, that's more straightforward. What's more obscure is the political periodization, which appears to be the more kind of, in terms of leftism, the more obvious. It's actually a more obscure question, I think, and needs to be investigated as an obscure question. In other words, what do we make of 1871 to 1917? Really, what do we make of that kind of history of Marxism? How do we understand that? And that's where I think, I would say, actually, that the RCP does a better job dealing with the concrete history of Marxism and communism than Badu does. I would just say that straight away. I would say read the polemic against Badu, read other documents of the RCP. I think that they do a better history of the left than Badu does. I think that Badu does a lot of sleight of hand with the history of the left. And I also think that he does this kind of, it's a sort of false modesty that he does. I'm only talking about France, right? And I also think it's indicative that he lowers his horizons to that level. That he says, okay, I'm talking about France and Neopatanism and, it's 1792 to 1871, and this kind of, there's a kind of French centrism that he kind of confesses, but that actually obscures things to a great degree, as if you could understand the history of the French left endogenously, just in terms of the history of France. I don't think that you can. So that's the other point in terms of raising a kind of political periodization at a world historical level. I mean, I don't know that there's necessarily anything to cash out from that, but I think it's at least raised as a question. How do we understand periods of world history as manifested in the history of the left?
Bruno, do you have a comment?
Well, on this question of why Badiou, why now, I think what Joe was saying, I thought was very eloquent. The question of these sort of percolations that happen, and that it is interesting to see. You say harmful about state and party. Well, if we look at the way these ideas have been deployed, and that goes well beyond the Anglo-Saxon environment, by the way, which is Badiou is sort of a recent discovery, but he's been incredibly important. For example, in Latin America, but also in Spain, the ETA, Basque separatists, were reading his works on Maoist theory of contradiction, early 70s. It was extremely important among Argentine Maoists in Mexico, among exiles from the Argentine dictatorship. So to somehow say that he's a concentration of a general bourgeois revisionism against part of the first state, stage. I mean, I would almost say, then why doesn't Sarkozy decorate him with the Grand Honneur or something in France? I mean, rather than putting his son in jail.
His books are subsidized.
All books in French are subsidized.
Yeah, but certainly
if you write in French, I'll get you book subsidized to do the translation. All books in French are subsidized,
okay.
Of course.
I didn't know that, but I would always sort of see that kind of funny flag thing.
Of course, because
and
the translators, they know that
French loves Badu.
French, that's of course.
Okay.
Badiou is writing from within that whole framework. He's subsidized, and he's a state employee, so he's paid by the state. Much to the chagrin of the person who's in charge right now. But I'm not saying that that there's not some truth to what you're saying, that the appeal may have something to do with a certain understanding of leftism that you would probably find somewhat of a deviation towards a bourgeois or leftist or anarchist kind of side. But I wouldn't generalize that in terms of what this work, and not to personalize in terms of Badiou, this type of work, let's say the post-Althusserian school, or certain theories that are mixing France and Italy. What those are doing among different people, as Joe was saying at the beginning, varies vastly. And again, it's almost sort of a fear of success, right? No, we have to shoot him down before. Dangerous for what? Dangerous because this is a capitalist rotor in disguise, or because some people might get up their asses and maybe suddenly feel that there is no longer anything to be ashamed of, to use the word socialist or communist today, right? Who is to say what the valence of these thoughts are? But again, I would agree that the RCP or many other people do a better job at writing the history of the left. Badiou has no interest in writing the history of the left. And a final word about the ontology, which is sort of transhistorical. Badiou never said that his mathematics or his number theory is helpful at all for politics. At all. So to sort of continue this conflation of ontology is one thing, it's a specialist, professional deformation philosophy that they want to have their ontology, but that's one issue. If you ask Badiou point blank, what do you do to analyze in what you would call a scientific way? What would you do to analyze any given situation? what can I learn from ontology, from numbers, from set theory? And Badiou would say, nothing. And he says, you're probably right that the whole question about contradiction, principal aspect of the contradiction and so on is way more helpful. Or, political economy. And Badiou is not saying this is wrong, Badiou is saying, this is right, but it's not immediately helpful to come up with a political, with political watchwords. To move from the analytical part of understanding, capital, it is not so easy to jump to, local singular political intervention. And that's the real issue. But if we conflate this and say, Badiou uses mathematics and displaces the historicity of a process, of a sequence, then we're really not reading Badiou properly, because we're transposing, one question, which is an ontological question, purely philosophical, onto politics. And about politics, mathematics has nothing to say whatsoever for Badiou. It can serve a heuristic purpose of highlighting how to think in terms of impasses, but it's purely analogical or heuristic.
So, when I get back to the force of my question, which was the idea that Badiou has to stop sort of leading people astray, that are mystifying or confusing people, that seems to me actually problematic and paternalistic about the capacity of people across the world to think these problems. So for me, the question is just simply what remains unthought in Badiou. He himself, I think, would agree with. Yeah. What is unthought, we might want to think about.
Maybe one more question there.
Okay, go. All right, very, very quickly, please.
Ideas have consequences. People act on their understanding of what is true and what is not true. If Badu is correct, then everything he's saying is monstrous and wrong and leading in the wrong direction. If Badu is correct, if the party-state paradigm should be left behind, if it's produced monstrosity, if it's irredeemable or saturated, if he's wrong, that has consequences. And the way it's not paternalism, the greatest paternalism of all is to not argue out the ideas to their fullest conclusion, but to be unsparing, to refuse somehow be unsparing in your argumentation and your debate. Ideas have consequences. Either Badu is correct, either he is summed these up correctly, or he is not. He's not casting Badu into the camp of the enemy.
Is there such a thing as somebody who has some interesting things to say that may be correct, but some of the others are taken to an extreme?
The false modesty of Badu, I think he's saying a bit more than I have.
No, he's not a modest person.
He is putting forward,
but in terms of interpretation,
this is the road forward. I'm not, he's putting it forward in a way that happens to suit the sensibilities of this time. Hence the false modesty that one of the panelists was pointing to, which I think is insightful. There's a tremendous role for what there's a tremendous role for speculation. There's a tremendous role for utopianism. There's a tremendous role for out of left field ideas of all kinds. That should all be part of the churning. But it's churning with a purpose, to try to ascertain as best you can what is the most correct reflection of the reality you're trying to change. His passion comes, and I took it from passionately wanting to change the reality that everybody, I think, in this room finds unbearable.
Well, I think we better wrap up now. We're already over time.
What about closing comments?
Well, I think
Wrap it up.
I think there's an opportunity to talk to people after everyone leaves. Thank you very much, everyone.